but to a number of high-placed individuals in Washington, D.C., with a story that the Kennedy administration had been involved in an effort to kill Fidel Castro, and that had backfired on the Kennedy administration, that there had been a conspiracy in regard to JFK's death, and that Castro had been behind it. In Washington, D.C., we know that that storyline was being pushed by John Roselli, ultimately through Drew Pearson. But we also know that separately, the story was being promoted to other outlets. For example, the largest news radio station in New York City was also investigating and preparing to air a special on exactly the same story. In addition, some of Pearson's associates were actually taking a conspiracy story to the FBI. And later, in spring of that year, Bernardo de Torres, in both Miami and New Orleans, would undercut District Attorney Garrison's investigation by going to the press with an extended story about a Castro-involved conspiracy against JFK. There are signs that there were other people leaking the same story. So by early 1967, you had a lot of rumor and gossip going about a Castro-originated conspiracy against JFK. Let's go to the next slide. The interesting thing about that is where the story really primarily seems to have originated. And one of the things that makes it particularly interesting, and we'll get to that in a moment, is that the source for the story was actually quite credible. The story was largely spread and promoted, especially in Washington, at the highest levels in government there, by John Roselli. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with John Roselli. Sometimes the information on Roselli is accurate, sometimes it's not, so I'm going to take a few minutes and discuss enough background to Roselli so that we can really appreciate why he was a credible source for such a story. Roselli was an illegal immigrant. He had originally come into the United States through New York City and started out basically as your average street hood in New York City, an enforcer on the street, and moved on to Chicago to do the same sort of street strong-armed activities there under Capone. But eventually he had health problems which led him to move west to a much healthier climate. And he entered the L.A. environment again as a street enforcer, primarily in L.A. in the gambling rackets. L.A. has always been a major street activity in terms of large dollar gambling, and was at the time, in many instances, in gambling boats right offshore. Roselli established himself in that and actually got involved with the National Organized Crime Syndicate in 1928 when he accepted an assignment from them to set up a gambling wire in Los Angeles. Roselli did well in Los Angeles. He was trusted. He did a lot of minor tasks for the Eastern Syndicate in particular, and eventually he became a point man for some high-dollar investments and served as point for the Meyer Lansky network for investing in the film industry in Hollywood. For example, he brokered one deal which brought in $500,000 into Columbia Pictures. So throughout the 1930s, he had really moved up the level and become a major film industry contact, if you will, for organized crime, and particularly the Eastern Syndicate. In the 1940s, he went on and began organizing investments in gambling in other areas, first in Reno, Nevada, and later in Las Vegas. Became really known for a person that could be trusted for bringing large amounts of money in and covertly putting them into gambling businesses. All right, we'll go to the next slide. By the 1950s, Roselli had become a major player in investment in gambling. He worked, again, for many people, but a lot of them Lansky associates, and involved themselves in organizing investments in the Sands, the Fremont, and other casinos, and really built himself up a good ongoing source of money from those deals. Didn't have to do a lot of work. The 1950s was Roselli's decade, and so much so that he became essentially the syndicate person on the West Coast for not only the film industry but for doing deals in Las Vegas as organized crime really began to move heavily into casino operations. And that earned him a place on the FBI's top put 'em list by 1957. Because of his services and because he was quite trustworthy, when Meyer Lansky took an assignment from Batista to clean up the casinos in Havana, Lansky called in Roselli as his point guy to go into the casinos as a manager and report on who was running an honest business, well, relatively honest business, and who wasn't. And Roselli really gained a major reputation as a player in the Havana casino business. But primarily, that was an assignment for Lansky, and personally, he remained active in Las Vegas, continuing deals and moving to entertainment deals. The casinos were pretty well established by that point in time, so he became very active in facilitating entertainment coming out of Hollywood to service the hotel performance industry in Las Vegas. So that begins to give you a bit of an idea who John Roselli, whose business card referred to himself as a strategist, and it certainly was not your average street criminal. It gives you a good idea as to who Roselli really was, which becomes very important when you look at why he became a credible source in regard to possible conspiracies involving Cuba. The interesting thing is that we often focus on the CIA as being the driving force behind Castro assassination projects. But actually, the first known, recorded, pretty well organized attempt to kill Fidel Castro was in 1959 in New York City during Castro's trip to the UN. And that attempt, although it was thwarted, was found to be coordinated out of Las Vegas by people connected to Meyer Lansky. And it is possible that Roselli was involved in some fashion, certainly may have been connected to it or aware of it. The interesting thing in that regard is that ultimately in the fall of 1960, when the CIA reached out to touch someone to help them work on a Castro assassination project, they ended up being introduced to John Roselli. Roselli, by that point in time, may have already had a reputation for such things. He certainly had a reputation in Cuba. It's interesting, when the CIA contact, Robert Mayhew, was asked how he was led to pick John Roselli, Mayhew said, well, he had been to Las Vegas and he just knew that Roselli was the kind of guy that Mayhew. At that point in time, Roselli was known to Mayhew and known to several people in Washington because he had some extremely influential contacts with Washington, D.C. lawyers and lobbyists. And Mayhew had met him at parties in Washington, D.C. Roselli was extremely close to Fred Black, who was a serious lobbyist and a business associate of Bobby Baker and actually a neighbor of Lyndon Johnson. So Roselli was more than most people might expect. In any event, as this CIA push gelled, Roselli was asked to make introductions to individuals who knew people who had people who could operate in Havana and were willing to take on a Castro assassination activity. Roselli himself accepted and got involved in it. The interesting thing about that, however, is it became clear afterwards that Roselli did this at his own initiative. It was not something that was sanctioned by the National Crime Syndicate. It may have been given a head nod by Meyer Lansky, but it was a very dangerous project, and as history would prove, led to Roselli's downfall and the downfall of pretty much everybody involved in it. So it was a high-risk proposition that Roselli engaged into, and would essentially spell the end of his heyday in both Vegas and Los Angeles in Hollywood. Let's go to the next slide and elaborate on that a little bit. What we do know at this point in time is that this Castro plot itself was not nearly as compartmentalized as we would have once thought. At one time, we were led to believe that really nobody within CIA operations, nobody within the Cuba project knew about it. Well, now we've seen documents that show that there was big money in it, that Roselli himself was given some $200,000 in cash out of the Cuban operations, and it was authorized by both Bissell and J.C. King and countersigned by Cuban Operations Chief Easterline. So the whole point that nobody knew that there was a CIA assassination project going on is just totally wrong. It was compartmentalized, but it was well known by the chief players in CIA Western Hemisphere and J-Mark. That's an interesting thing for us in the larger perspective, but as far as this story goes and the backstory to that newspaper column goes, the bottom line was that early on in the project, the whole thing became compromised. The FBI learned about the CIA project due to an arrest and a bugging thing in Las Vegas involving Mayhew and Giancana and the Andrews sisters. No need to go into that. But the point was that the first attempts in 61 all failed. And the only thing that really happened is the FBI became very much aware of what the CIA was trying to do and very much aware of John Roselli. And Roselli's activities at that point in time became highly compromised because Hoover was more than interested in collecting any information on this that he could and using it as leverage with RFK and with the Justice Department. So at that point in time, Hoover ordered a massive surveillance project on Roselli that began in 61 and continued and was ongoing in 1967. And as you can imagine, once somebody gets that sort of FBI heat on them, some of the people that have been doing business with them become a little cautious. And so at that point in time, by 62, 63, Roselli's influence as a deal maker really began to sour. Going on, Castro assassination phase 2. So Roselli was doing himself no favor by his involvement in this Castro project. He's certainly doing himself no favor from a financial standpoint, what he might have been doing for someone else and for influential purposes. That's another story. But he agreed to in the fall of 62, he agreed to continue his involvement, agreed in a meeting with William Harvey to participate in the ZR Rifle Executive Action Program, although that would not have been known to Roselli. Roselli just knew that he was being asked to continue with the Castro assassination attempt. Harvey himself had gotten very involved in this, had worked initially with some support by James Angleton. The whole point of the project was to run it, and largely like Angleton had been running certain counterintelligence projects and set up the assets to be used as communist agents. That's another story that leads us back to ZR Rifle. But what I'm interested in here is talking about the fact that Roselli did agree to participate, tightly bonded with Harvey, and for our purposes, all of this was absolutely known to the FBI. Because of the surveillance that they had going on against Roselli, the FBI was quite aware that the projects were continuing. They were quite aware of his contacts with Harvey of the CIA. And again, if you were sitting there in the FBI, this is a very serious ongoing story. You know, that Roselli has syndicate connections, but you know he also has some very important ongoing CIA connections and is the guy that would know anything about a Castro assassination project that was going on at the same time. So this is just a little background to establish the point of who Roselli really was and why he would have essentially instant credibility with any story that he would choose to generate. All right, let's go on to the next slide. As you can imagine, if you were in Roselli's shoes with the FBI tapping the phones in your apartments, monitoring who your girlfriends were, monitoring and getting phone records from every hotel and motel that you travel to, having your parking place under physical surveillance. And we're talking about surveillance of a level of, they knew when, and I've seen reports. I mean, there are thousands of pages of reports on this Roselli surveillance. They knew when he was in LA. They knew when he was at his girlfriend's. They knew when his girlfriend's was there. They knew when he was in Las Vegas and who he was having drinks with in Las Vegas. They knew when his car was gone from his parking place. This is pretty massive stuff. And as a matter of fact, by that point in time, by 1966, they had determined that he was very likely that he was indeed illegally in the country, and they had begun to offer him deals as an informant. Lots of FBI pressure on Roselli, lots of offers to do deals, to provide information, all of which Roselli assiduously rejected. He could have had a deal anytime he wanted with the FBI. For that matter, if he had wanted some kind of other deal, he certainly had access to people in Washington, D.C., through Fred Black, all the way to Lyndon Johnson and his staff. But Roselli was not interested in doing any deals. Instead, he went very low profile, stayed largely in LA, used the money that he already had coming in from his various deals, and essentially went into retirement. That would be the first half of 1966. As 1966 began to go into the fall, and as District Attorney Garrison began his investigations, we know that, among other things, Garrison was very interested in some of the Cuban contacts that Lee Oswald reportedly had, and Garrison actually sent investigators to Miami to start looking into trying to identify photos and trying to see who in the Cuban community could help him track down these connections. Well, ultimately, that resulted in his being connected to a gentleman named Bernardo de Torres, who told him he could certainly help the district attorney. And as that turned out, that was probably a major trap for Garrison. I'm not going to go too far into that, but that was what was happening in fall. And as most of you know, Garrison's investigation during the early months was kept relatively quiet. It wasn't a media story. It wasn't the press. Garrison was going about it covertly, and not really many people knew about it outside New Orleans at the end of 1966. The fascinating thing, however, is that in December of 1966, Roselli, who had been seriously attempting to keep a low profile, suddenly went to Washington, D.C., went to a very well-placed and influential lawyer, connected to both Lansky and Mayhew, a lawyer who had been cleared by the CIA and used by the CIA in certain contacts beforehand. And Roselli gave this lawyer, Morgan, a detailed story about the efforts to kill Fidel Castro. And beyond that, he told Morgan that they had resulted in the death of JFK because Castro's people had captured one of the assault teams, somehow turned them around, and forced them to go back to the United States to kill JFK. Now, this is not the kind of story you want to be telling in Washington, D.C., if you're trying to maintain a low profile and not come any further to the attention of the FBI. So one of the questions that has to be seriously asked is, why would Roselli do something this dramatic and something this stupid? That's something to think about a bit later, but let's go to the next slide and see what happens with this story. The first thing that Morgan did was to pitch the story to a media person that he knew personally, Jack Anderson, who was an associate of a true superpower at that point in the press, Drew Pearson. Jack Anderson set up a meeting with Morgan and Pearson took the story to Earl Warren as well. As fascinating. So at the same time, Morgan is going to the media, we have people that are taking this new conspiracy story to Earl Warren, to the Secret Service, to Chief Rowley, and Rowley passes it to the FBI. And none of these individuals want anything to do with it. Now, a very interesting thing of that, of course, is the Secret Service may not have known what was going on. Earl Warren may not have known what was going on with John Roselli, but the FBI certainly knew that John Roselli was in a position to tell a real story about Castro assassinations. And Hoover and the FBI showed no interest at all, nor did they go back and tell anyone else. They didn't go back and say, Mr. Warren, you really need to look into this guy because we know that he might have the goods. Nothing. It's just the story is thrown out at the highest levels in Washington, and everybody backs off from it. Having become pretty frustrated with this lack of reception, Pearson goes on to personally call President Johnson and relate elements of the story. As that's happening on January 16th, the investigation in New Orleans is beginning to become exposed, and within a month, it will become public knowledge that there is a live Kennedy assassination conspiracy investigation going on in New Orleans. But all that we've been talking about has occurred before that. It's all backstory stuff. It's all going on in Washington before anybody officially has heard these stories about the Garrison investigation. Of course, by February 18th, Bernardo de Torres, who Garrison had really hoped would be a big help, himself starts going to the press, telling everyone that there absolutely was a conspiracy and that Fidel Castro was behind the whole thing. And that's what D.A. Garrison will be revealing, no doubt. The press gives all kinds of coverage to that, and of course, none of that helps Garrison's cause any at all. All right, let's go to the next slide. So, at this point in time, we've got Earl Warren that has chosen to ignore this story. We've got Secret Service that's chosen to ignore it. We've got the FBI that's chosen to ignore it. The only person who responds to this story and really starts to do anything with it is none other than President Johnson. On February 20th, President Johnson had called Attorney General Clark. And by the way, if you're wondering how we know all of this, actually lots of it is right off the White House telephone taping. He called Attorney General Clark and asked him, what was going on, and was there any talk that on the street about a Kennedy conspiracy? Is anybody hearing anything new on the subject? And Clark told them that, as a matter of fact, there were rumors that were now coming out of New Orleans, and this is in February, that Johnson himself was somehow involved in the assassination. In turn, Johnson gives Clark all the details about the Castro assassination project. So you have the president who starts his call just by saying kind of what's new, ending up by feeding the whole storyline about a Castro conspiracy to Attorney General Clark. And one of the things I love about it in the conversation, Johnson, in his inimitable fashion, says something to Clark along the lines of, well, maybe you really need to look into this whole thing again and see if your department missed anything. Like, okay. Johnson's telling the Attorney General that he should have the Justice Department relook at the Warren Commission, relook at the Kennedy assassination, Or is he suggesting they just go back and look at all the evidence in hand and make sure that they have nothing that contradicts the official story, which, as a matter of fact, is what happens, certainly with the autopsy evidence. That's another and much longer story. On March 1st, Garrison actually arrests Clay Shaw and charges him with conspiracy. Interestingly enough, in March, Johnson gets a completely separate call, and this one is totally off the wall. It's hard to fathom where this comes from, but it's yet another source of a storyline that Castro was behind the assassination of JFK. Governor Connally of Texas actually called Johnson and tells him that he's heard this story that the United States was trying to kill Castro, and Castro took it poorly and actually somehow got in contact with Oswald, and that Cuba and Castro's behind this whole thing, was behind this whole thing. There was a conspiracy. And as a matter of fact, the biggest news radio station in New York City, CBS News Wins, is covering the story. They've got investigators all over the place. They're sending them to Cuba, and something may break any day on this. Where Connally got this story, we have no idea. It seems to be a completely separate track than what was going on with Roselli, raising the question of just exactly how broad was this whole storyline being circulated? How broadly was it being